Today I'm sharing a recipe for how to make stock. It's not broth and it's not bone broth, but it's a wonderful gelatinous liquid that can be ready in 2 to 3 hours, and it's nutritious and flavorful and makes a wonderful base for sauces and gravies. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest. I'm a former New York City girl, but I live the simple life now with my sweet husband here in the Texas Hill Country. And this channel is all about cooking from scratch, living naturally, and creating a cozy home. So if you're like me and you want to live the simple life no matter where you live, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Stock is very easy to make, and what you'll want to start with is about 4 to 5 pounds of bones. Now it's different than broth, where we use more meaty bones and the focus is on the meat and creating a protein-rich liquid. Here we're going to use mostly bones with very little meat on them to create more of a gelatinous liquid. And if you want to learn more about the difference between broth, stock, and bone broth, I'll link to the video that I had done previously where I explain in detail all of the differences. So what I've got here is about 4 pounds of marrow bones. Now that's just what I had on hand. You can use any bone that is mostly bone with very little meat. So you could use knuckles, you could use patellas, or sometimes they're called patella femurs, which is the kneecap with a little bit of the thigh bone from the cow. Specifically, this is beef stock that we're making. In another video, we'll talk about chicken stock, but this is beef stock. So we've got the beef marrow bones, or as I said, the knuckles or the patellas. They all make wonderful stock. So I've got the bones, and then I've got some celery, I've got 2 onions, and about 2 carrots. And I haven't peeled anything, just cut it up roughly, and that's perfect. In many ways, this is like making bone broth, where you just throw in whatever veggies you have, and you don't have to be particular about it, because we're gonna strain all of this when we're done. Now all I'm gonna do is just drizzle a little tiny bit of olive oil on the veggies, and I'll just put a little bit like that just to help them with the browning process. Because what we're going to do is we're going to brown all of this together right in the oven. I'm going to do it 425 degrees, and I'm going to watch it, but maybe 30 to 45 minutes. I want to get everything nicely brown, the bones brown, the veggies brown, a lot of good color on them. And then I'm just going to take the little bit of olive oil that's left on my hands and just rub these bones like this, just to put a little coating on them, since they're really just primarily bones with a little bit of meat and there's not really much fat. So just give them a little bit of that and just massage these vegetables a little, and we'll get ready to put this in the oven. Well, I'm just going to wash my hand, and then I'm going to just put a little freshly ground cracked pepper on this, and that's it. I'm not going to put any salt because I've shared with you in the past, I like to put the salt in the end product so that I have a stock or a broth or a bone broth that I can season accordingly depending on what I'm going to use it for. And also the second reason I don't add the salt now is I like to use that wet gray Celtic sea salt, and that's a living food, and so I don't want to cook it and destroy the nutrients. And by a living food, what I mean is it's very rich in minerals, and I don't want to degrade those minerals by having them simmer for a while in a warm liquid, because that would degrade their efficacy. And so I like to add the Celtic gray sea salt after the fact. And before I get this in the oven, there's one thing I want to mention. After you make stock, because you'll see when we go through the whole process, do not throw these bones out. Save them. They're only going to simmer about 2 to 3 hours, and there's still going to be plenty of nutrition left in them. So they can be used to make another batch of stock, or you can add them to whatever batch of bone broth that you're making, beef bone broth specifically. And if you're not ready right away to make another batch of stock, Then you can wrap them up tightly and refrigerate them for up to 2 days. Now, some people will say 2 to 3 days. Certainly you could try 3 days, but then give them the sniff test if you do leave them in your fridge 3 days. I feel 2 days is best. On the 3rd day, they may have a little bit of an odor, and you don't want that to transfer to the stock or the bone broth that you might be making to use them. So I recommend 2 days. Now, if you think it might be a while before you're making stock or bone broth, then you can freeze them. And again, wrap them tightly, especially for the freezer. Use some type of appropriate freezer container for them, or freezer bags, so on and so forth. And again, I wouldn't freeze them any longer than 2 months. Now, some people will say 2 to 3 months. I feel at 3 months they're starting to get a little freezer burn, and that again then can put an off flavor into your broth or into your stock, or into your, not your broth, into your bone broth or into your stock. So I would label them and try to use them within 2 months. So just a couple of twists of the black pepper, and then we're going to go ahead and put this into the oven, 425 degrees, 30 to 45 minutes. I'll keep my eye on it, and then I'll show you what we'll do next. Well, I just took these out of the oven. All the veggies are nicely browned, and the bones are nicely browned. And when you do this at home in your oven, check it. I checked it halfway through, tossed the vegetables around, moved the bones around, and then I put it back in for the rest of the 45 minutes. And every oven is different. So what you want to do is you basically just want to look, it might take a little less than 45 minutes, might take a little more. You want to just see that your bones are getting some nice color to them. See, the little bit of meat that's on this bone has taken on a lot of color. And that's what you're looking for, some nice color. So what we're going to do now, you just want to get yourself a good sized pot, something that will accommodate the bones. And we're going to put the bones into our pot, and then we're going to put in the vegetables, and then we're going to deglaze the pan. And now we're just going to add some water right onto this jelly roll pan or baking sheet, and we're just going to let that soak a minute to loosen all of the fond. The fond is all those little bits and bobs of browned meats and vegetables and whatnot, and we'll loosen that up, and then we're going to add that to our pot. And while we're waiting for that to be ready to deglaze, I'm going to add in a bay leaf and just a few peppercorns, just a small tiny little handful, and that's it. And then next, because we're using bones and we're making stock, we want to extract as much nutrition from the bones as possible. And the bones contain, various vitamins and minerals, but they also contain collagen. And we want to leach out as much collagen as we can so it will be a nice gelatinous stock. And the way we do that is by adding some acid so that it's cooking in acidulated water. Now, I know some people like to use vinegar, but I've expressed with you or shared with all of you in the past, I don't like to add vinegar, whether I'm making bone broth or stock. I really like to use some type of wine or fortified wine. So I'll use a white vermouth or a red vermouth, Marsala, Madeira, Port, Sherry, whatever I have on hand. And I especially like the fortified wines, which I think I've shared with you in the past, is that I may not necessarily have a bottle of wine, the wine that you would drink on hand. And if I did have some that was open and just had the cork in it and it was like in the back of the pantry somewhere, it may turn to vinegar. But the nice thing about the fortified wines is that they usually come with a screw top and they last a lot longer than your regular wines. So that's what I usually keep on hand and use for cooking. Now today what I've gotten here is some, I believe this is Marsala. So I'm going to go ahead and add this into my pot here, and that will serve as the acid to help leach out that collagen from those marrow bones. I'm just using a spatula to loosen the various bits and bobs, so to speak, on my baking sheet here. And I'm doing this here on my kitchen island so that you can see. But normally what I would do is I would remove the bones and remove everything from my baking sheet, and then I would put it back into my oven and keep it warm. And the reason that I do that is if it's in your oven and it's warm and you pour the water in, it's much easier to loosen all of these bits and pieces. So I just want to give you that little tip. If you're doing it at home in your oven, remove everything. You can even, you can even use the tongs, to remove everything onto a plate that you can then transfer to the pot that you're using. Or you can move the baking sheet out of the oven like I did, transfer it to your pot, and then put the baking sheet back into the oven, and with the door open, but just so that it stays warm. And then you can pour your water in and everything will loosen. Then you can bring it out while it's still warm and everything will loosen up a little easier. So I'm just going to use my spatula to lift out some of these things that are floating to the top. And some of it's fat, which is fine. I want all of that in the stock for flavor, and we'll skim that off later. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick this up. Wish me luck that it goes in easily. And I'm just going to pour this right in to the pot. Perfect. Okay. Now I'm going to see what other little bits I can get off of here. And I'll continue to do that, and then I'll show you how much more water we need to add. Now what I'm going to do is just fill the rest of this with water, and I just want to cover the bones by about 1 inch. I think that'll be good. And I'm going to take a picture of this so you can see exactly how I have it filled. And I'm going to turn it up to high. I'm going to bring it up to a boil. I'm going to turn it down to low, and I'm going to let it simmer with the lid slightly tilted to allow for a little bit of evaporation. And we're going to let that simmer about 2 to 3 hours. Well, this has been simmering about 2.5 hours now. And so I'm going to remove the lid, and then we're going to remove the bones and put them into this bowl. And now I'm just going to remove all these vegetables from the stock, and then I'll show you how we strain it. Now we're going to get ready to strain the stock. Now, normally I would be doing this over a large 8-cup measuring cup that I have, a glass measuring cup, but that's being used because, as I've been sharing with you, as we've been doing all of these different broth stocks and bone broths, that I've been experimenting with making perpetual bone broths. Not that they go on and on forever, but to see how long I can extract nutrients from the bones that would still make a gelatinous bone broth. So I have a lot of bone broth in my refrigerator, and my 8-cup measuring cup is holding some of it right now. So, but instead I'm just going to use a bowl. But if you're doing this at home, if you have one of those big 8-cup measuring cups, or even a little stock pot, something like that, that'll work very well, because as you see, we're going to use the strainer, and you'll see the strainer, it fits low down into the bowl. So it's going to fill with the stock quickly, and then I'm going to have to decant it and kind of do this in steps, as opposed to if I had something more cylindrical, I could do it in just one fell swoop. But I wanted to use a glass bowl so you could see exactly what we're going to do. So you're going to have your vessel underneath. You're going to put some type of strainer like this. If you don't have this, you can use a colander also. And then you can use cheesecloth. I like to use flour sack towels, and you can find these at any of the big box stores. They usually come in a package of 10 or 12, something like that. And the reason I like to use these is you can reuse them, wash them, reuse them. I've had these for years, and they just hold up beautifully. But you do have to, clean it off and wash it, as opposed to cheesecloth, which you might get a few uses out of, but then you'd have to discard it. It'll start to disintegrate a little. But also, sometimes if you don't even want to wash it out and you want to just throw it out if you have a very busy household, certainly that's an option. So all I'm going to do is just push this flour sack towel down into the strainer there, and then I'm just going to take the stock and I'm just going to start to drain it through here. And the reason that I'm lining this with the cheesecloth, it's starting to cool off already, so the fat is congealing. You'll see the fat's congealing. The reason that I do this process is there's a lot of little bits, and you'll see it once I strain it through here, that tend to congeal at the bottom of the stock once you refrigerate it. And certainly, you know, at that point you could kind of remove your stock off the top and discard it and whatnot. But I just find that, you know, it's never perfect. And when it comes to stock, because you're going to be using stock primarily to make like sauces and gravies, that it's just nicer to filter it at this point and try to get out as much of the debris as possible so that you have a really nice, clear stock. So I just want to show you, see what I'm catching, all of the little bits of debris, and actually now the fat's rolling down because this has cooled off a bit. But normally the fat would be liquid, it would be going through, and that's why I would also use my fat separator, which I'll show you what we'll do next. But that's what I'm trying to get out. All of these little bits to just make a nice clarified stock. And not exactly clarified in the sense the way the chefs use that terminology, because I believe they add a little, once they do all this process, they then, I think, simmer it with a little bit of egg white. And that egg white apparently gets even more impurities or debris, I'm not quite sure, but we're home cooks, so we don't take that step. But this, I just wanted to show you, this is why I'm using the flour sack towel. Now normally the next step that I would do is use this fat separator, which is such a handy little thing. And I would take the ladle and I would just scoop some of the stock and pour it through here. And then I would fill this up, and at the top you would see a layer of fat. And then I would just press this button and this little contraption on the bottom would open up, and I would let all of the stock drain into another bowl, and I would stop when the fat that you would see at the top here, once it got down to the bottom, then I would stop. This is kind of a modern day, if you've used an old-fashioned fat separator, you see how lovely this is. It's very unique. And so I would just have, you know, I would just stop when the fat got down to the bottom. But because this had cooled a bit, all of the fat was actually caught in my strainer, and you can see it's mixed right in with all the little bits of debris that I was talking about earlier. So we just have this beautiful stock, defatted for us and ready to decant. Now you could take this and store this in your refrigerator for about 2 days. As I said, some people, you know, might say 2 to 3. Again, you know, I like to use it up within 2 days. I just feel it's got a fresher aroma to it. But certainly, you know, 2 to 3 days is considered acceptable. And then freezing it 2 to 3 months. And now something you can do is you can freeze it in whatever portion sizes you think you might need. You can use little containers, little plastic bags. I don't recommend canning jars. I know a lot of people have asked me about that. I think that if you were to store this in canning jars and then refrigerate them, or freeze them, you'd need to be very careful about the headspace because, you know, it does expand. One option that I do store when I want to store in glass in my freezer, I use those little French jelly jars. And I know exactly where to fill them to allow for the expansion of whatever liquid I'm freezing. But the nice thing is they have little plastic lids. And if for any reason the broth or bone broth or stock expanded more than the jar, but I've never had that happen, but the plastic lids would just probably pop off. But and if you watch my chicken bone broth, and I'll link to that, the roast chicken bone broth video that I have, I show the jelly jars with the little plastic lids that I'm talking about. And you can even store this in ice cube trays so that if you want to just throw in a couple of ice cubes when you're making a sauce, that can come in so handy in your frying pan and you want a little stock. You can do that. You can store it in 1 or 2 cup portions to use for when you're making gravy. That's a perfect amount that's handy and make a very tasty gravy. You can also take this now And you could reduce this by half or even more and get it to the point where you had what they call demi-glacé, you have to excuse my pronunciation, but and then you have a really rich stock, and that's very nice to do and then put it in the ice cube trays, because you can just take like one ice cube, put it in a frying pan, after you've cooked something and you want to make a really nice, rich tasting sauce. That's delightful. So those are just some ways that you can store it and use it that can really make it a wonderful helper in the kitchen for making sauces and gravies. And one other thing I want to say about stock is that it's very nutritious. Stock, unlike broth, is high in gelatin, whereas broth is high in protein because you use more meat than you do bone. But when you make stock, you use more bone than you do meat. And we extracted the collagen from the bones using the fortified wine that I added. And so this is very high in gelatin, which is very nutritious. It nourishes our joints, moisturizes them more or less. It is very good for your hair and your nails and so on your skin. And it also, probably one of the most important things, in my humble opinion, is that it nourishes our gut. And it creates a very hospitable environment for good gut bacteria. And as we hear so often from scientists, I know you've heard me say this before if you're familiar with my videos, that good gut health seems to mean, or at least help with good overall health. So stock can be very nutritious. And if you don't have time to make bone broth, and you just have about 2 or 3 hours, you can make stock. And you can have something that's gelatinous and, as I said, in my humble opinion, very healing. Now, that said, as I mentioned, broth is high in protein, stock is high in gelatin. And when I say broth, I mean traditional broth. I'm not talking about bone broth. And I'll link to the video where I make broth. Broth is something that's made with more meat than bone, and it can be simmered as little as 45 minutes. So if you're in a rush and you need a soup base, broth is perfect to make. You brown your meaty bones, and you're on your way. And you can simmer it longer than that, but really 45 minutes is going to produce a lovely broth. Whereas stock, 2 to 3 hours is going to produce a great stock. So you've got your broth high in protein, you've got your stock high in gelatin. And then third is your bone broth, which is high in protein and gelatin because you use meaty bones as well as the marrow bones and the high cartilage bones. So you've got your meaty bones, you've got your marrow bones, but then you add your high cartilage bones, which help make it even more gelatinous than stock. If you'd like to learn more about broth, stock, and bone broth, be sure to subscribe to my channel and then click on this video over here where I explain the differences between all three. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.